So many headlines, so little time. Hello and welcome back to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. It is unbelievable. You have no idea what I have to cut in order to keep this show a reasonable length of time. The gigantic copper story. It's not even the beginning of the news section, if you can believe that. Wait till you see the story on China and aluminum coming from Bloomberg. That is what's starting the news section. That'll be in a little while. So let's begin. Lots to get through. Now, we've been speculating here quite strongly on the rare earths and the dual-use role that China has been emphasizing. Wang Yi, the foreign minister for China, has been explicitly stating, as we quoted in depth last show, on the dual-use export laws. And I looked up on the new Grok 4.0, which I have to say is quite good. Dual use refers to materials, technologies, or items that have both civilian and military applications. So we've been speculating here on the heavy rare earth front that, okay, perhaps we heard the weapons were being drawn down in Ukraine. Perhaps that has something to do with the heavy rare earths, which China processes 99%. The magnets that you often hear about, it's 90%. So it's very important. It's actually crucial to understanding this whole issue. You have to parse it out. Because if you just talk about rare earths as, oh, China controls 90% of the market, it does not provide you with an accurate representation. Really what's going on, as far as we can gather here with our antennae, the best that your host's mind has to offer here is that the neodymium praseodymium magnets, those are controlled 90% by China. Now, the big deal that happened last week, amazingly, actually following our speculation, was that the Pentagon was investing $400 million into MP Materials, which runs the Mountain Pass mine, previously owned by Molycorp before they went bankrupt. So this is all happening. Now, there is a story which just came out today. Basically, breaking news. NVIDIA's CEO says it has U.S. approval to sell its H20 AI computer chips in China. This is the Washington Post a few minutes ago. So these are, as far as I understand, the advanced AI chips, as it says here, to sell its advanced H20 computer chips used for artificial intelligence to China. So, of course, we come from the resource area over here, so I'm always looking at that angle. And what I see here, to continue our speculations, which are still holding up from last week, I might add, I would actually say this adds more evidence to it. The fact that the U.S., which was just recently trying to scale back AI technology being exported to China, the fact that they're opening it up, something that Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, has argued is actually in the U.S.'s favor. Nevertheless, the government has been clawing back the technology. The fact that they're opening it up says to me, as I speculated on a previous show, that the real deal here is the heavy rare earths, which again, China controls 99% of, which are crucial in the tips of missiles. In other words, samarium, to name one important one, where we saw the huge write-up by the New York Times in June. So it seems to me, if you were to read between the lines here and speculate a little bit, first of all, I wonder if China thought that they would actually get this. Because now that the U.S. has opened the advanced chips from NVIDIA to China, now does China have to reciprocate and say, here are your heavy rare earths for military application? Like, is this the story behind the story? And one wonders if, the U.S. called China's bluff. That in a sense, China thought, well, they're never going to give us the AI chips, so let's make a demand for that because that seems quite fair. If they're going to cut off the chips, well, we'll cut off the rare earths, and we don't want to send them to them anyways, but then all of a sudden the U.S. gives them the chips. Which is why I start with this. Now, we have more circumstantial evidence here as this increasingly becomes a military narrative, and it was before, but it's increasingly dominant. Now, we had more circumstantial evidence that is quite interesting. We had a big story in The Guardian coming out last week, an exclusive. U.S. only has 25% of all Patriot missile interceptors needed for Pentagon's military plans. Exclusive. Low stockpiles for the crucial Patriot missile interceptors led to Trump administration pausing transfers to Ukraine. So they have low stockpiles, and, until perhaps today, we have the heavy rare earths, as far as we can tell, being cut off. It's not clear, which would suggest that it was at the minimum still under negotiation, or that really nobody really wanted to talk about it. So just a little bit on this Guardian article. This is by Hugo Lowell in Washington. The stockpile of the Patriot missiles has fallen so low that it raised concern inside the Pentagon that it could jeopardize potential U.S. military operations, and Deputy Defense Secretary Stephen Feinberg authorized the transfer to be halted while they reviewed where weapons were being sent. The determination last month to halt the transfer, as described by 4 people directly familiar with the matter, so that sounds like a leak, doesn't it? Was based in large part on the Pentagon's Global Munitions Tracker, which is used to generate the minimum level of munitions required to carry out the U.S. military's operations plans. According to the tracker, which is managed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the stockpile of a number of critical munitions has been below that floor for several years since the Biden administration started sending military aid to Ukraine. So, I don't want to go too deep on this, but just one more sentence. Ukraine is also largely unable to directly buy weapons from defense contractors for its purposes, since a new order is estimated to take years to fulfill, and it would only be completed after the Pentagon had its own orders completed, since the Defense Department is a higher priority customer. Spokespeople for the White House and the Pentagon confirmed some transfers would resume at Trump's direction, but did not specify whether the weapons being sent to Ukraine would involve munitions at critically low levels. So that was a pretty big deal, that story coming out. That was on July 8th. Then on July 10th, we get a story, which you probably already heard, MP Materials lands multi-billion-dollar Pentagon deal. This is Cecilia Jamasmy at mining.com. MP Materials has entered a multi-billion-dollar public-private partnership with the U.S. Department of Defense to build a domestic supply chain for rare earth magnets, reducing America's reliance on foreign sources. The deal will make the DoD the largest shareholder in MP Materials, after acquiring $400 million worth of preferred stock. The investment is part of a broader investment package and long-term strategic commitments from the federal government, the company said on Thursday. Now, here is the press release. MP Materials announces transformational public-private partnership with the Department of Defense to accelerate U.S. rare earth magnet independence. And here are the sticking points. DoD has entered into a 10-year agreement establishing a price floor commitment of $110 per kilogram for MP Materials neodymium praseodymium products stockpiled or sold, reducing vulnerability to non-market forces, and enduring stable and predictable cash flow with shared upside. So we heard the CEO of Platinum Group Metals in the Financial Times just last week saying that the West basically needs to introduce a price floor. Here we are, days later, we have a price floor for neodymium praseodymium magnets. These are the ones that are 90% produced and controlled by China. And here are more sticking points. For a period of 10 years following the construction of the 10X facility, DoD has agreed to ensure that 100% of magnets produced at the 10X facility will be purchased by defense and commercial customers with shared upside. The company has obtained a commitment letter from JP Morgan Chase Funding and Goldman Sachs Bank USA to provide $1 billion of financing for the costs of constructing and developing the 10X facility, subject to customary terms and conditions set forth therein. In addition, within 30 days, the company expects to receive the proceeds of a $150 million loan from DoD in connection with its plan to expand its heavy rare earth separation capabilities at Mountain Pass. As part of the agreement, DoD agreed to purchase $400 million of a newly created series of the company's preferred stock. And finally, DoD is positioned to become the company's largest shareholder. with an aggregate 15% of the company's issued and outstanding shares of common stock on July 9th, 2025. So you see the heavy rare earths. So once again, the timing is interesting. And there is this article in the Financial Times how a small mining company won a big investment from the Pentagon. There was a quote I wanted to highlight. It was at the very end of the article. This is Todd Tucker, Director of Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute think tank. Quote, "There have always been these types of interventions, but they've been a little below the radar." And he's referring to the Pentagon investing and securing, critical minerals. Quote, "I think what's different is that they're being so explicit about it." You don't want to run away with this, but the fact that it came right on the heels of that Guardian exclusive, which seemed to show that stockpiles were low, commentators were starting to talk in the last week, mentioning, here and there, the rare earths connection. So what I wonder to myself, and I don't know, it is pure speculation, but I do wonder to myself, how much of this is actually a PR exercise? I think it's real in the sense that they need this stuff, and the fact that heavy rare earths are involved, the processing facilities. So it's very real. But the timing of it, again, maybe it's just accidental, but it is interesting, in order to shore up, to counteract this sense that, is the U.S., running low on weapons, and then you triangulate the heavy rare earth situation again, and you go back to our NVIDIA story. And you look at the NVIDIA story, it's like, wow, they're giving the best chips. All of a sudden, a 180, going from restricting AI technologies to now giving the best chips. What are they getting in return? And one assumes they're getting the heavy rare earths, if one had to speculate here. So again, we don't want to go too far on the speculation, but for us here in the, metals and minerals industry, as Teo Yamaogo would call it, it's getting pretty interesting when we're all of a sudden in the AI story, when we're all of a sudden in the geopolitical story. And this copper story, it feels like it's a dam that's about to burst here. It's been building and building for years. And again, it looks like we're about, 14 tabs away here from the copper story. Let's continue. We have a story from Reuters. U.S. rare earth pricing system is poised to challenge China's dominance. So Reuters put out an article highlighting the importance of this price floor, which is a remarkable development. As it says here, U.S. efforts to break China's dominance of the rare earths market and to drive investment in its own industry have moved up a gear with a Washington-backed plan to create a separate, higher pricing system. I mean, these are big words here. This is pretty radical. Again, for those of us who have been kind of staring at our computer for 15 years looking at mining stories. The West has struggled to weaken China's grip on 90% of the supply of rare earths, in part because of low prices set in China have removed the incentive for investment elsewhere. Again, 90% oversimplifies the issue. Let's continue. Miners in the West have long called for a separate pricing system to help them compete in supplying the rare earth group of 17 metals needed to make super strong magnets of strategic importance. They are used in military applications such as drone and fighter jets, as well as to power motors in EVs and wind turbines. And one wonders, there's a story that I couldn't put in here because there's simply too much going on, where China told the EU, basically, we're not doing anything wrong. And the EU is complaining seemingly pretty bitterly about the rare earth situation. And I think it comes down to this dual use issue, because the rare earths are starting to flow again. But I'm not sure with the EU wanting to, again, remilitarize, I'm not sure how much China is willing to give on the military side of things, and if it even feels the need. Whereas with the US, perhaps it feels there's a certain amount of diplomatic need to fulfill the heavy rare earths commitment without the US really getting mad, right? Without the US basically saying we're taking over Myanmar, right? So it's not like China can just keep the rare earths and say, too bad. The US will respond, and who knows what they would do. And we have some pretty big stories on Myanmar coming up here. So let's continue. Under a deal made public last week, the U.S. Department of Defense will guarantee a minimum price for its sole domestic rare earth miner, MP Materials, at nearly twice the current market level. And we have a quote from Ryan Castillo, Managing Director of Consultancy, Adamus Intelligence. Quote, "This benchmark is now a new center of gravity in the industry that will pull prices up," end quote. The DoD will pay MP the difference between $110 per kilogram for the two most popular rare earths and the market price, currently set by China. But if the price rises above $110, the DoD will get 30% of additional profits. Castillo said other indirect beneficiaries of the pricing system may include companies such as Belgian chemicals group Solvay, which launched an expansion in April. Quote, "It will give Solvay and others the impetus to command similar price levels. It will give them a floor to stand on, you could say," end quote. So here's the big question now. Are rare earths just the beginning of these price floors? The only problem I can see, you go, okay, great, we'll have a price floor. However, the problem is if all of a sudden all the metals cost more in the West, China and basically whoever buys their metal from China can manufacture for cheaper. So it's not super simple. This will, I suppose, guarantee supply. From a market perspective, perhaps a price floor isn't as simple of a fix as people might like. So let's continue. Wyoming's first new coal mine in decades to extract rare earths. So that is the Associated Press with a story on July 12th. So 2 days after the MP Materials story, Energy Secretary Chris Wright, Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon, and Wyoming's congressional delegation took part in a ribbon-cutting ceremony Friday for Ramaco Resources' Brook Mine outside Ranchester in northeastern Wyoming. Quote, "Not only do we get coal here, we're going to get those rare earth elements that are going to break our dependence on China," end quote, Wright told Fox News from the mine site on Friday. You know, when was the last time you remember having these kind of officials and Fox News at the ribbon-cutting ceremony? Continuing on, we have a story in the New York Times. What to know about the rush for rare earth metals in war-torn Myanmar. And this just came out July 11th. So Myanmar and rare earths in the news again. This takes more of an environmental angle. However, it does highlight where the rare earth mines are in Myanmar, and you'll notice they're very close to China. Now, we have some other stories. This is the Economic Times, I believe an offshoot of the India Times. How one tiny Myanmar town controls the globe's rare earth supply and is holding the world hostage. The real story. Bamo, which came out in that Reuters article last week, which China is telling the rebels to stay out of. Bamo, a town in the northern hills of Myanmar, home to just 166,000 people, may appear to be a small town, but is where almost half of the world's heavy rare earths are found, like the minerals essential for electric cars and wind turbines, as per a report. And we have another story. This is on a website called Discovery Alert, which is an Australian news website. And the headline is China risks global heavy rare earth supply to stop Myanmar rebel victory, riffing off of last week's Reuters report as well. But it lists out very clearly China's ultimatum to the Kachin rebels in Myanmar. Abandoning efforts to seize full control of Bamo, ceasing military operations against junta forces in the region, allowing stabilization of rare earth supply chains, permitting mining operations to resume at pre-conflict levels, creating a, quote, buffer zone around key transportation corridors. So as we see here, China's involvement is largely due to the rare earths. I don't think we can say 100% because it is on China's border. And there was a story that we had last August that the rebels were being supported by the West. And so they also have that interest as well. So interesting development there. And just one more in Myanmar. Kachin military spokesperson denies leader's arrest, but Chinese pressure mounts. So China is increasing pressure on the rebels in Myanmar. Another military leader who traveled to China for medical treatment was held to get armed groups in northern Myanmar to hand over the city of Lashio to Myanmar's military junta. In this case, the Kachin Independence Army has been in a long fight with the military for the control of the city of Bamo, a strategic hub for the rare earths trade. Meanwhile, other militias accuse India of bombing Myanmar's territory. That is all just the sub-headlines there. So one of the rebel leaders in Myanmar appears to be being held in China, which is kind of interesting. So it feels like China is ramping up the pressure here. And finally, we have a story from the FT on how the EU is looking to France for its domestic rare earth supply. And just at the end of the article, it says a French government official said the country wanted to revisit the EU's CRMA, which is the Critical Raw Materials Act, and introduce stockpiling requirements as argued for by companies including Solvay, who we heard about in a previous article. Europe is, quote, still quite far from having a developed value chain in place, end quote, even though France is doing what we need right now, said Eduardo Righetti from the Center for European Policy Studies, a think tank. Still, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was keen to talk up progress at the recent G7 meeting in Canada, where she brought up a permanent magnet made by Neo Performance Materials. It was, she said, quote, manufactured in Estonia by a Canadian company using raw materials sourced from Australia and will end up in German and French electric vehicles and wind turbines, end quote. So really, to me, what you hear here, this is probably going to happen across the entire metals spectrum. One imagines, or at least in metals that are dominated by China, which is pretty much all of them. So just a ton to get through here. We're going to tackle copper next in the news. Coming up this episode, I'm very pleased to welcome Carolyn Loder to the show, inducted into the National Mining Hall of Fame, and that is in the United States. Carolyn serves on the board of Integra Resources and on the board of K2 Gold and is board advisor to Kodiak Copper, and she's also part of the Women's Mining Coalition. So we're going to have a great discussion with Carolyn Loder this episode. Also coming up for this week's Spotlight, we have Rua Gold CEO Robert Eckford discussing the company's 2 gold properties in New Zealand. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at Northern Miner. You can find us on Instagram at The Northern Miner, and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts, and wherever podcasts are available, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's turn to Robert Eckford, CEO of Rua Gold, for this week's Spotlight. Joining us today, I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Eckford, CEO of Rua Gold, to this week's Spotlight. Robert, welcome to the show.
Very nice to meet you, Adrian.
It's great to have you, Robert. It's not every day we hear of a gold company in New Zealand, at least in these parts. You know, we are based out of Canada, but we are an international mining publication. For those that are not familiar with Rua Gold, could you tell us a little bit about the company, a little bit about its background?
Sure, definitely. And I think that's the excitement and opportunity for your listeners. I mean, if you think what built Goldcorp, it was Red Lake, and that's what kicked it off. And it was this beautiful orogenic deposit out in Canada. Well, New Zealand has that exact same geology. In the South Island, it's an orogenic greenstone belt, and it's really high-grade gold, and that's what's attracted us to this opportunity. We're gold exploration down in New Zealand. We have 2 projects, one in the South Island and one in the North Island. And we're very actively drilling it and moving it forward. And we have a team that's done this before many times. We've, as a board management, have built these companies. We're not your traditional explorationists. We're company builders. So we like to explore, find, organically grow, but also look at inorganic opportunities. And that's really what Rua Gold is, a New Zealand-focused gold explorer, because we believe New Zealand is the best jurisdiction in the world these days.
Okay, excellent. And just out of curiosity, I assume then that you list in the Australian markets. Is that correct?
That is a question I get a bit. And right now we're TSXV listed and an OTC ticker as well. We focused on the North American capital markets because, as I said, our management team have built billion-dollar companies. We've made a lot of money for institutions in the past. And so to go into this venture and find the high-risk capital, we're getting backed again by a lot of those institutions. And so we found the capital markets of North America more favorable, but that's more a management team than an asset. I do think down the road, there's a future where we have an ASX listing because of the asset location.
So in terms of the projects then, you mentioned you have a couple of projects. Reefton, I believe, is the flagship. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening at Reefton, that's in the South Island of New Zealand. What are you up to over there?
Sure. And again, a bit more background. I mean, we listed this company in March last year in 2024, and we started drilling down in Reefton immediately as we listed. We're finding really high grade gold veins. We're seeing grades up to 33 grams a ton over a meter. We've got a number of targets down there, and we've taken over 95% of this greenstone belt. So we have an area of Reefton, and it's called Reef Town because it's a historic gold rush town that they found a whole bunch of gold reefs at. So we know there's a lot of gold there. It hasn't been touched in any significant way since the 1950s. And we're the first company to amalgamate the whole lot together and start a meaningful exploration program. So this is an area of New Zealand. There's known gold. It's gold antimony style mineralization. And antimony is another sort of side kicker that we have to our project. But really, it's an area that we know there's a lot of gold around. We're just trying to find it as economically as possible.
Okay, excellent. So you found some high grades. How is the infrastructure over there? I mean, New Zealand's not a gigantic island. Are you fairly close to roads and electricity?
Completely, yeah. Reefton is actually a mining town as it stands today. There's a lot of coal that comes out of New Zealand. So maybe some of the lesser known facts on New Zealand is it has been a historic gold mining nation, and there's still two active gold mines there today, both owned by OceanaGold. It's produced over 40 million ounces of gold today. But importantly, in Reefton, we're sitting in a coal mining part of New Zealand because another main commodity exported out of New Zealand is coal. And so we're right by high voltage power, right by rail, right by highway, and a skilled labor force and a very open community to the mining industry. So all things really working in our favor. And maybe just as an extra plug for New Zealand, the fact that the government there is so proactive on pushing for mining, they've actually changed legislation. They've improved investment opportunities. They've made it you can get a mine permitted in New Zealand in 6 months. That's not proposed. That's not hearsay. That's actually now written into the legislation. They proposed that back at the start of 2024, and it was written into the law at the end of the year. And now there's companies out there, including OceanaGold, that are in that 6 month permitting timeframe to get a mine permitted and built.
That is quite interesting, Robert. Then where are you in the project then? Sounds like you've gotten some results. Where are you at in this project?
Sure. I mean, I say we listed last year. The company was private since 2019, and that's important because this isn't a rush to market situation. We've spent a long time accumulating these tenements, doing a lot of the surface field work, a lot that the share market doesn't have the patience for. We stayed private and did it then. Now, when we listed, we're actively drilling, and now today we have 2 rigs turning. We've got drill results coming. We've got close to 500,000 ounces of a resource proven up already. And so we're really actively trying to expand on that and then go into the next phase of studying. And maybe it's a Canadian versus Australian approach of mining. And my accent might give away my sort of history. But we find the Canadians spend their drilling for 5, 6, 7 years to get the biggest resource possible. And then the Aussies take a different approach. They drill out the minimum amount of gold they need to find, and then they'll get it into production and start cash flowing and expand it from there. And we're taking much more of an Aussie style approach in that sense, that we're really looking to prove out 1 million or so ounces and then get into a study phase that justifies building a plant there. And so that's where I say we're not traditional explorationists. We are on that phase of the company right now where we're proving out and building ounces on our balance sheet. But really, the goal is to put this into production, taking advantage of that 6 month permitting process.
Indeed. And so do you have the permits, or is it something that you have to do at a later stage? What about that side of things?
Correct. We have to do that at the later stage. So we've got all our drill permits to explore at the moment. And then once we know where the economic gold within the Reefton district will come from, we have to do the normal environmental studies, water studies, land earth movement, and all that sort of the normal permitting process still applies. It's just the processing time from the government side is that 6 months. So we need to do the full study process still. Once we find where the most economic gold is, we'll apply that into the study and then we'll kick off that next phase.
Okay, excellent. So you won't be left in limbo for years, as can happen. around the world. Although this is improving all the time. I mean, what a change we've had in the last, 5 to 10 years here. Complete sentiment change from governments. In terms of funding, of course, this is important. And, a lot of exploration companies, the landscape has improved somewhat for funding, but it's not necessarily paradise yet. How is Rua Gold doing in terms of funding its activities?
In short, we're well funded now. We've just last month closed a $13.8 million financing. It was a straight share. And we've done 3 of these financings in the last year as we've expanded the business. And all of them have been at market without any warrant. And so to find let's call it a microcap or an exploration company that doesn't issue warrants with its financings is very rare. And we've done that 3 times over, and we've done them at market. And again, drum home to the fact that we're very well supported. We've got 26% of our shares held by institutions, 20% of our shares are held by insiders. So we are very well supported in and amongst our own ecosystem. And so when we go out to market, we're well supported. But in short, to your answer, we've got a well-funded drill program now following that 13.8 million financing we just closed.
It sounds like it's all coming together fairly well. So looking out then in the, say, next 6 months to 2 years, what do you see playing out here? What are your, hopes or expectations of where you see Rua Gold going?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be looking forward to. I mean, as I said, we've got 2 drills turning down at Reefton, and they're already pumping out some really nice high-grade results that we're expecting to continue for the next 12 months as we move this development forward. One thing we haven't talked about much is the North Island asset, and that in its own as a company maker. And the North Island of New Zealand, it's a bit different. It's an epithermal style mineralization up there. That's where all the volcanoes and the hot springs of New Zealand are. And if anyone knows the Ring of Fire, you talk about these really amazing deposits up at Papua New Guinea or Japan and places like that. You've got these epithermal style mineralizations. They're company makers. And the Hauraki district in the North Island of New Zealand is exactly that. And it's been proven out by the fact that 10 million ounces of gold has been taken out of the Wahi open pit, which is 10 kilometers from our project. It's a neurology story. It's greenfields, and we're going to start drilling there at the end of this year once we get our exploration permits up there. And that's an important project for us because these epithermals are huge deposits. And so that's complete company making, a complete game changer for anyone that holds the story. It's the sort of blue sky. Reefton is your solid ounce builder that we're going to get moving along. But the epithermal Glamorgan target in the North Island is that sort of overnight game changer when you have the drill hole that hits.
Amazing. So as we wrap up here, Robert, what message do you have for investors? What do you want them to know about Rua Gold and take away from this conversation?
I mean, I think it's a known factor. A lot of investors, especially at this phase of the mining cycle, you focus on the management team. So I think, number one, look at who's behind this story. We're not going to stay a $50 million market cap or a $60 million market cap for long. We're here to build another billion-dollar company, which we've done multiple times over. I think, secondly, I'd encourage everyone just to look at New Zealand and look at what they're doing from a proactive mining perspective. You mentioned it, that other governments are really talking about it at the moment, but New Zealand is 18 months ahead of that. They've passed the talking phase. They've now got it written into law, and they're using it effectively. And so I'd encourage people to look at New Zealand because I call it the best jurisdiction in the world because I really believe it is. They've done a lot for the mining industry and they're really pushing it hard. So that's probably the 2 key takeaways, obviously outside of our own company results.
Robert Eckford, CEO of Rua Gold, thank you for joining us and telling us all about the company on this week's Spotlight.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Great to be here.
And thank you once again to Rua Gold for sponsoring this week's episode of the Northern Miner Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit ruagold.com. That's RUAGOLD.com. Turning to the website, this very interesting story from Bloomberg News via mining.com. Chinese tycoons are turning Indonesia into an aluminum giant. So first it was a nickel giant. Now Chinese tycoons are doing it again with aluminum. Chinese tycoons are turbocharging Indonesia's aluminum industry with multi-billion-dollar projects that rival the vast bets made on the country's nickel riches roughly a decade ago, and threaten to shake up the global market for the metal. Grappling with production curbs back home, companies like billionaire Zhang Guangda's Tsingshan Holding Group, China's Hongqiao Group, and Songjianbao's Shandong Nanshan Aluminum Company are turning to Southeast Asia's largest economy, plowing cash into new smelters and refineries. Goldman Sachs Group estimates Indonesian aluminum production could rise fivefold by the end of the decade. The question metals traders are now asking is whether Chinese capital can continue to pour investment into the country without ultimately tarnishing the outlook for the energy-intensive metal required for everything from soda cans to robotics and electric vehicles. Nickel provides a cautionary tale. Indonesia accounted for roughly 7% of global mine production a decade ago. It now accounts for closer to 60%, thanks to cheap coal power and Chinese smelters. Having underestimated that rapid rise, metal giants like BHP Group have been forced to shutter operations in Australia and elsewhere. Even the Indonesian industry is now creaking under the weight of its own success. Quote, over the next 5 years, Indonesia will become the focal point for the global aluminum industry, end quote, said Alan Clark, director of metals consultancy, CM Group. Quote, it's really interesting to look at what's happened in the global nickel sector and compare it, end quote. Granted, Indonesia's reserves of bauxite, the raw material used to produce aluminum, are nowhere near as large as the low-grade nickel riches that took the industry by storm, thanks to technological innovation. They are still enough to support a sizable smelting industry backed by cheap labor and coal-fired power. And one wonders if that bauxite is going to come from Guinea. And in smelting, Indonesia is also making great strides. 2 plants are already operating in the country, and another 4 should be online by the end of the decade, according to Goldman Sachs. Now, as we've mentioned many times here, and as many know, aluminum takes a huge amount of electricity, and are they going to power that with coal? That's a little frightening. Indonesia's bauxite restrictions initially pushed China to buy from Guinea, the world's largest producer. But the West African country is flexing its own supply dominance by canceling mining rights of firms that refuse to take the next step to construct refineries there, a move that only reinforced China's desire to diversify. Some Chinese metals tycoons are offering to bring their own plants piece by piece or providing financial backing for local players unable to secure funding, according to Agustinus Tan, president-director of bauxite producer PT Laman Mining. Quote, there are a few factories closing down, and they offered to acquire the machines, end quote, said Tan, whose firm is looking to start building its own refinery next year. Quote, it's better to be far from the end product user than far from the raw material, end quote. In other words, it's better to be close to the raw material, and if your end user is far away, that's not as big of a deal. Interestingly. And just a little more here. Among the largest Chinese investors is Tsingshan, the stainless steel conglomerate that led the breakneck expansion of Indonesia's nickel sector thanks to dramatic scale and a ruthless focus on costs. Its first aluminum smelter was commissioned in 2023, and a significantly larger one is due to start production next year. Quote, when Tsingshan entered into aluminum, everyone was shocked, end quote, said Andy Farida, an aluminum analyst at Fast Markets. Quote, they are diversifying, end quote. And finally, we have a quote from Lou Defy, a veteran analyst former with miner Rio Tinto and Chinese researcher Anteke, pointing to questions around power supply. Quote, many in the market believe most of these plans will never materialize. If smelters can't secure safe and affordable electricity, including cost-effective construction, they're at a dead end, end quote. Finally, we have a quote from Farida, though, which I think is worth mentioning here. Quote, I don't think we should doubt what the Chinese are able to do. If they're able to do what they did in nickel, it would not be surprising if the forecasts look far too low. So potentially the start of something quite large happening in aluminum. Turning to copper, of course, the big news last week, Trump's 50% copper import tariff said to cover refined metal. This is Bloomberg News on mining.com. U.S. President Donald Trump's promised 50% copper tariffs are set to include all refined metal, indicating the president's far-reaching efforts to bolster American production of one of the world's most ubiquitous materials. Trump's announcement of the levy, which he would begin August 1st, was devoid of much detail, but refined copper will be included, According to people familiar with the matter who asked not to be named as discussions are private. Refined copper represents the biggest category of the metal that is imported by the U.S., and including it in the tariff list will have widespread impacts. The metal is vital for electric grids, construction, automaking, and consumer electronics. Semi-finished products would be hit with levies, Bloomberg News reported earlier. So not only refined copper, but also potentially, quote-unquote, semi-finished products. And continuing on, Trump's copper tariffs pile more metal misery on U.S. auto industry. This is Reuters via mining.com. Indeed, how does one compete with a 50% tariff on copper? U.S. President Donald Trump's threat of a 50% tariff on copper imports is raising alarm in the U.S. auto sector, as it could make it even harder for car makers and suppliers to absorb border taxes and rising costs, executives and industry experts say. The duties on their own may be manageable, but prices of the red metal vital for making cars, in particular in wire harnesses and in motors for electric vehicles, have soared to record highs. Exactly. So not only do we have record copper prices, but U.S. manufacturers could potentially get a 50% addition on record copper prices. The U.S. market is heavily reliant on imported copper, aluminum, and steel, and developing new capacity could take years. So users are scrambling to buy metal from a limited number of suppliers, spurring price rises. Added to import tariffs on those metals, as well as higher prices in the United States, the extra costs are compounding the financial strain on car makers and parts suppliers, interviews with a dozen executives, industry analysts, and experts show. Car makers have been so far relying on inventories to avoid raising prices, but could be forced to pass on mounting import tax costs to consumers. Some like Ford and Toyota have already announced hikes to mitigate other Trump-induced tariffs, while Porsche expects a $351 million hit to results from tariffs for April and May alone. Quote, this copper tariff complicates an already difficult situation, end quote, for the auto industry, said Dan DeYoung, lead analyst for copper demand and prices at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Trump's announcement of the tariff this week propelled prices on U.S. platform to a record $5.68 a pound, or $12,526 a metric ton, a premium of more than $2,920 a ton over the price of the London Metal Exchange, currently around $9,600 a ton, which the market uses as the global benchmark. The rate is effective August 1st. The U.S. Midwest duty-paid aluminum premium paid on top of the benchmark LME price for physical delivery has tripled to 60 cents a pound since Trump was inaugurated. U.S. top car makers GM, Ford, and Jeep maker Stellantis declined to comment for this story. After a chaotic week in the copper market, suppliers to car makers have already asked their customers this week to pay more for their product because they cannot afford the additional costs, experts say. And we have a quote from Takashi Imamura, an executive officer at Japanese trading house Marubeni, who said on Wednesday a copper tariff would mean higher costs for U.S. consumers. Quote, when the U.S. government reconsiders the damage, my final expectation is that they will reduce or eliminate the tariffs, end quote. So, of course, this is all talk at this point, but a lot of concerns out there. Another headline, this is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Rio Tinto wants to invest more in U.S. copper under tariffs. So perhaps this is the result that the U.S. government is looking for. And here's a quote from the company's copper head, Katie Jackson, who said in an email, quote, there is increasing recognition by the U.S. government of the need for domestic sources of copper and other critical materials to support manufacturing and to power the country's energy future. We have a strong desire to invest more in American copper, and we see significant opportunities to grow our business in the United States. As well, we had Robert Friedland come out and also support it. So miners are in favor of this, and this is by Cecilia Jamasmi at mining.com. Friedland backs Trump's copper tariffs as wake-up call. Ivanhoe Mines founder and billionaire Robert Friedland has backed U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to impose a new copper tariff starting August 1st, calling it essential for building a domestic copper industry. And here's a quote that Friedland gave in an interview with the Financial Times. Quote, there's a new list of critical raw materials, and without it, you can't do anything about global warming or greening the world economy, and you have a critical vulnerability in national security. I commend the Trump administration for doing what's obvious and intelligent. America needs to produce the metal, end quote. Now, scrolling down the story, you see an interesting quote from Jefferies LLC analysts, including Christopher Lafemina, who said, quote, "The U.S. does not have nearly enough mine, smelter, or refinery capacity to be self-sufficient in copper. Import tariffs are likely to lead to continued significant price premiums in the U.S. relative to other regions," end quote. So one does wonder, would you be better off, in a sense, just encouraging people to build smelters and refineries rather than going the tariff route, which will potentially damage your manufacturing in the process, and you just subsidize the smelters and refiners? And finally, Barrick is carrying out a $2 billion plan to double annual output from its Lumwana copper mine in Zambia to 240,000 metric tons by 2028. Barrick will also extend the mine's life to 2057. So Barrick just put out a press release announcing the expansion of Lumwana. So Barrick not giving up on Africa after Mali and doubling down on Zambia. Speaking of Mali, Barrick hit again as Mali helicopters take off with $117 million in gold. This is by Cecilia Jamasmi, and we see a wonderful stock image of a helicopter flying away. Mali's military government seized over $117 million worth of gold from Barrick's Loulo-Gounkoto mine days after junta leader Colonel Assimi Goïta signed a law allowing himself to stay in power indefinitely. The seizure took place when state helicopters landed unannounced at the site and removed roughly 35,000 ounces of gold, or slightly over 1 metric ton. And we have Mark Bristow responding on Friday. Quote, "I want to reaffirm Barrick's commitment to Mali even as we navigate extraordinary and unprecedented challenges. While we continue to engage constructively with the government of Mali, the ICSID process provides the legal certainty and international oversight necessary to resolve this dispute definitively," end quote. And continuing on, Lockheed Martin reboots Pacific seabed mining plans. That's a headline on mining.com. And just an excerpt, the U.S. defense giant holds 2 licenses in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a mineral-rich area of international waters in the eastern Pacific. They were granted by U.S. regulators in the early 1980s during the first wave of interest in ocean mining, but remained unused for decades. Continuing on, BHP to explore Chinese battery partnerships. You know what's amazing about the news this week? I could have started the podcast with any one of these stories, including this one, and I considered it. BHP to explore Chinese battery partnerships. This is by staff at mining.com. BHP has signed preliminary agreements with 2 of China's leading battery makers to evaluate the use of electric vehicles across its global mining operations. The partnerships with CATL and BYD's FinDreams Battery are to focus on developing powertrain battery systems for heavy-duty mining equipment, BHP said on Monday. The companies also plan to study locomotives, fast-charging infrastructure, energy storage, and battery recycling to cut diesel reliance and curb greenhouse gas emissions. BHP and CATL are to jointly research and develop battery modules for haul trucks and locomotives, particularly in Western Australia's iron ore corridors, while the FDB partnership will explore BYD's commercial and lightweight vehicles for site-level mobility and flash-charging stations to displace diesel use. So, interesting partnership there. So those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market. The U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 4.42%. That is up 0.02% on the week, so edging slightly higher. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 4.58%. That is down 0.08% on the week. Italy's 10-year bond is yielding 3.58%. That is 0.01% higher on the week. And the German 10-year Bund is yielding 2.69%. That is 0.04% higher on the week. And perhaps the standout is the Japanese 10-year bond is now yielding 1.58%. That is up 0.08% on the week and the highest that we've seen since we last hit that high about 3.5 months ago. So interesting developments there. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $3,367.80 per ounce. That is $30 higher than last week. Silver is trading at $38.55 per ounce. That is $1.56 higher than last week. So nice jump in silver. Platinum is trading at $1,397.40 per ounce. That is $33 higher than last week. And palladium is trading at $1,240.50 per ounce. That is $123 higher than last week. So silver, platinum, and palladium continue to move. And turning to industrial metals, look at copper. Copper is trading at $5.51 per pound. That is 47 cents higher than last week. So big jump in copper. Iron ore is trading at $96.71 per metric ton. That is 47 cents higher than last week. So basically even. Aluminum edges higher at $1.18 per pound. That is a penny higher than last week. Lead is lower at 91 cents per pound. That is 2 cents lower than last week. Nickel is trading at $6.82 per pound. That is 6 cents lower than last week. Tin is trading at $15.26 per pound. That is 3 cents lower than last week. Cobalt is unchanged at $15.12 per pound. And lithium is back above $9 at $9.02 per kilogram. That is 30 cents higher than last week. And uranium is trading at $71.75 per ounce, a big drop. That is $5.65 lower than last week. And zinc edges higher at $1.24 per pound. That is 2 cents higher than last week. Zooming out, silver, platinum, palladium, and copper steal the show. Big moves across those metals, while lithium gets above $9 a kilogram. So the question remaining with lithium is, has it bottomed? Otherwise, metals trend sideways with the exception of uranium, which did have a large drop, and those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome Carolyn Loder, Director and Chair of the ESG Committee at Integra Resources. We see how things are going for women in the mining industry. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I will see you on the other side. Joining us today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast, Carolyn Loder, who has been inducted into the National Mining Hall of Fame in the United States and is a board member of Integra Resources and K2 Gold and a board advisor to Kodiak Copper. Carolyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. You were recommended to me over email, and you had a very interesting resume and background. For those that are unfamiliar with you, could you tell us a little bit about your story and how you got started in mining and just kind of how you got to where you are right now?
Well, I think it's pretty easy for me. I started as a child because I grew up in a rural area, and nearby was the Pine Creek tungsten vanadium mine. And all the kids in school, most of them, their parents worked at the mine. So I got exposed to rocks and literally the use of the word mine. I knew what a mine was, and I knew what people did in the mining industry. And being in a rural area, the love of rocks, it flowed from there right into getting a degree in geology. But the problem was this was the late 60s, early 70s, and the professors were, what are we going to do with the only girl in the department? And it was, you're not going to get a job out on the drill rigs, particularly the oil rigs in California. So they kind of steered me over into mineral rights. And I have to really be grateful for the professors at the university that eventually went on to get my master's degree, and then I went on to get a law degree in Indian law. So it's a little bit of a transition, but it's still all based on rocks from a young age.
Well, it sounds like you're kind of ahead of your time to a certain degree, say a woman in the mining industry when it wasn't that common, and also doing, what we'd call sometimes Aboriginal or Indigenous relations way before before it was cool, as they say. How did you get involved with that so early?
And you really hit it on the head there. It was 30 years ago that I started working with, and in the US, the Constitution is Indian. So that the terminology, the best way to look at it is when you refer to someone, it's better to call them by their tribal name. But generically under the Constitution, it's Indian law. And 30 years ago, starting in the industry, there was no one that had any experience in dealing with mining on tribal lands. All the law firms, they had no expertise. And we found the companies I was working for, we found we were getting into trouble and we were making mistakes and we were doing acquisitions and divestments that weren't under the statutes of the US. And two of the companies said, maybe we should pay for you to go get your law degree in Indian law so we know what we're doing. So I kind of fell into it out of literally one company where we were locked out, chain was put to a cost, and all the assets were seized by the tribe. So I quickly became the expert in Indian law 30 years ago.
That is so interesting. I imagine when you're studying and you have that kind of scenario on your hands, it probably lights a real fire under you that, like I have to learn this. And you're probably just, reading this stuff from morning to night and not really complaining about studying. Like, I have to learn this immediately. Like, was that what it was like?
I found it fascinating because I knew nothing. And whenever I do a presentation, I always say 99.9% of what you think you know is wrong. So I start over with the history of the United States and walk them through sovereignty, because there is so much misinformation. I was like a sponge. It was every day, I'd leave class as the only over 30 person in the room and just want to tell everybody of what I had learned that day. It's just fascinating. We really don't know, as a society in the US, we really don't know what the statutes and the rules and regulations are in Indian country.
So, in a sense, and I don't know if it's possible for you to, you know, present a kind of summary answer, so to speak, but I mean, where are we at, say, with mining in the United States in regard to, different tribes and groups? Is there a way of summarizing it, or is it just simply too complicated?
Well, the first thing we say is that it's very complicated. And the other thing I always say is if you know one tribe, you still know nothing. But I think I could summarize it in the sense that what people misunderstand is they use terminology wrong. And they talk about sovereign nations. And they don't even know what that means when they say it. The key word, to summarize it quickly, is tribes have sovereignty among their members. So they are self-governing. They're like a government to government relation. And in the US, the problem from the tribal perspective is they only have a voice in certain areas. Otherwise, when those areas are different, they're the same as any other stakeholder. And so the tribes are trying to get more, not only a voice, but they want to be sitting at the table, and they aren't at the table yet in the US. Very different from the other countries, but they really only have a seat in terms of consultation. They can tell people what they want, but they don't have a veto vote.
And, to put you on the spot a bit, I mean, what do you think of that? Like, is that working or is this not working?
It's not working at the federal level, but it's working at the mining company level. The mining companies have caught on, not all of them, but most of them have caught on and said, this is a risk factor. We need to start addressing it. We need to calculate it into our number crunching. And that if we don't have the buy-in and we don't have the support, or at least neutrality, this is going to cost us in the long run. And for the most part, in this era right now, the mining companies, like I said, they've caught on, and many of them are, irrespective of what's going on with the rules and regulations in the US right now, they're still going on and doing that tribal consultation work, irrespective of whether they have to do it or not.
Which is, I suppose, a good news story. In a sense, they're being proactive about it and not just saying, well, the law is the law, and if we don't have to care, we don't have to care. So, I mean, that sounds like a good news story, that in a sense that they are being proactive about it.
And they are, I'd say we're probably about 10, maybe 20 years behind Canada. There are still companies here that's like, okay, the law is law. Yeah, we don't have to do anything. All right, we're not going to do it. But for the most part, particularly the exploration companies, they're seeing the future, and they're seeing that they're not going to get off the ground. They're not even going to get their drill rig in if they're going to avoid or just, quote, follow the law. And we got a long ways to go in the U.S., but it's coming slowly.
Interesting. And wasn't there the resolution copper decision that just happened recently? And wasn't there a tribe that was against the development of that project and that some court had ordered that basically the mine could go ahead? Do I have that right?
Resolution copper is it's complicated. It's a very different situation in that they were doing a land exchange. So it's different than other companies that are on federal land and need their permits. They went the legislation route years ago and got legislation approved that would accept their project dependent upon a condition. And that condition was the submittal and acceptance of the final environmental impact statement. So it's not typical, and it's not even comparison to what any of the other companies are doing because it's a land exchange. And there are tribes who were against it. There were some who were neutral, some supportive, and then there were the activist group in the tribes. So there was a lot of misinformation, and as it wound through the courts, a lot of the decisions were based on the activist tribal groups that didn't have standing. Everyone was paying attention to it, but for the most part, it was probably 99% not applicable to any of the other companies that are going forward in Indian country.
This is fascinating, and I feel like we could fill the full interview actually with the subject. But I want to get to the Women's Mining Coalition. But just before we move on, for those that are listening, what do you think it is, if there's anything that we haven't said about this topic? Like, what is it that you kind of want people to know about this and kind of where things are going and just what's happening? What do you want people to know?
In terms of the tribal side, is I wish more companies would be accepting of stepping into their arena, is at least engaging with them and establishing, it may not establish trust, but start the engagement and the respect. And that's difficult for many mining companies. They're nervous about it. They don't know what they're committing to. But if they get the right people in their company that can lead them through that, the tribe would be very happy to just have some respect to start with and that engagement. They're looking for at least the window to open. They're not expecting the door to open, but some companies won't even open the window. But those that are, and those that are opening the door, they are moving quickly, and they're finding out that their projects are going to move quicker, and not only going to move quicker, but it's going to be a better project because they're addressing issues at the beginning as opposed to the end when they're in the courts.
Okay, excellent. Now, bringing it back to your career a little bit and bringing us forward to the Women's Mining Coalition, you're in the National Mining Hall of Fame. What are some of the big, turning points in your career that you experienced? What are some of the, highlights, turning points that really stand out to you as you look back, say, today?
Well, being inducted into the National Mining Hall of Fame, what was amazing to me is that I'm the first woman in 100 years to be inducted. It's just almost mind-blowing that there are women that were inducted, but it was more than 100 years ago that they were alive. Mother Jones was inducted, and it's just surprising that it's taken that long. But the really good thing about it is that I was a different person inducted. I was recognized for honesty and integrity in the industry and bringing in stakeholder engagement and the things that we're talking about. So that says a lot as opposed to someone who was a CEO of a company for 40 or 50 years. So the industry is changing. They are looking differently at people now. And if you look at who's being inducted into the National Mining Hall of Fame, there is a change. And I think it's a real positive change that we're recognizing that literally the industry is changing.
It's quite interesting and speaks against the stereotypes somewhat, at least like 100 years ago, that they had inducted women into the National Mining Hall of Fame. That's quite impressive. And then I guess it devolved from there. But it's kind of impressive way back then that they had done that. Do you feel that way?
I think that era was very interesting. The 1800s, the start of the mining law in the U.S., and that was really the start of the westward expansion, discovery of gold in California. So it's amazing the number of women that were part of that era. But then from that day on, there's just a big gap, a huge gap. And so now they're coming back in. But like I said, it's been 100 years. That's a long time.
Indeed. Now, you're also involved with the Women's Mining Coalition. So, could you tell us a little bit about the Women's Mining Coalition? What is the mission of the group?
Most people, they hear the name Women's Mining Coalition, they think of it as a women's organization. We have men in the group, and it's basically an advocacy group advocating for the mining industry. It's not a networking group. The primary focus is the annual fly-in, and that has just become quite the event. What happens is women from across the nation go to Washington, D.C. in all walks of life. They may be a haul truck driver, they may be a CEO. It is just bringing that face to the industry and to the legislators. And when someone walks into a legislator's office with the hard hats on, they get the attention. And at the last fly-in, they mentioned several times of how there were other groups there that were lobbying, and the legislators were all, we want to meet these women in mining. Who are they? And they would get in every door before any of the other groups, because the legislators really don't know what mining is. And I can say the general public doesn't know either. So the coalition is just to have that fly in and bring that message that U.S. jobs, which women hold, and today's regulations and modern technology can ensure a state-of-the-art protection for the environment through the mining industry. And they're the best voice to say, we believe in what we're doing. And the legislators listen to them, and they do get the doors open.
That is fascinating, and it's so true. I feel like the rare earths is a great example of, society, really the public and, government officials having to really do a crash course in, what's happening, because all of a sudden it's like the heavy rare earths are 99% processed by China, but the magnets are 90% processed by China. Those are different from critical minerals and all this sort of thing. It really does speak to what you're saying. Like, how do you think that's going, by the way, like the general education of, say, policymakers? It is top of mind without question. I mean, how's your sense of how things are going from a governmental perspective towards the mining industry?
Well, it's probably two parts. One, I think the mining industry has to start changing their messaging. It's a different generation coming along, multiple generations, and I feel like we're talking to ourselves. We have all these great programs where we say, who we are and what we are, but we are not resonating that message with the younger folks. And when you go to DC and you meet with the staff, which is a younger person versus the legislator, it's two very different perspectives. The staff members are the first ones that will ask about, well, what is the state of the art environmental protection? They will hit with the hard questions, where the older group will say, well, what are the economics? How many jobs is this going to create? And I think the industry needs to start thinking of who their focus group is going forward at the governmental level. And right now, with this administration, it's very proactive for mining. And I think that gave everybody kind of a little boost. It's like an energy drink. It's like, okay, maybe we can get our mine permitted in less than 20 years. Maybe we can get it in 18, and geez, maybe we can even get it in 15 or 10. So everybody's got a little bit of an energy drink in them right now for mining.
Yeah, very interesting. And I mean, who do you think the focus group should be? Like, is it the policymakers who are focused on the jobs and the economics, or is it more really maybe the younger generation with the hard-hitting questions?
It's the hard-hitting questions and why they need it. They do not understand where anything comes from. And when someone shows them a picture, we have posters that they used to take and say, well, this is where your cell phone comes from. They don't get it until they see it in real life, that they are going to lose something that they have. they don't get it and they're not paying attention because it'll just come from somewhere else. They don't even know where their food comes from, let alone where the metals come from. And getting them out to the mines, we're not going to get them out there. So it needs to be more of a global concerted effort to get that messaging to the new generation because it is changing. There is no doubt about it. Go back to Washington, D.C., and you'll find that the legislators are listening to their staff. And it's like staff says, we don't get it, and it's put in another pile.
Interesting. It's like it's all abstract, right? Like they don't feel it. And that's a tricky thing to educate, actually, I would argue.
Very tricky, very difficult, but there are people that are getting messages out for other commodities. So we need to learn from that. And we've got to change our messaging at some point.
Okay, excellent. Now, in terms of the Women's Mining Coalition, would you call it a lobby group then? Or,
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the lobbying works and sort of how that plays out in like practical terms?
On the practical side, in the past, up until this year, it's always been there is legislation actively going through. So it is meeting with the legislators or most of the time the staff members that are working on the legislation and saying, this is what we have a problem with. This is why the wording is bad for this particular piece of legislation. This was probably the first year where there wasn't any legislation to oppose or pick apart. It was, well, let's talk about what we can get through and how we can advance permitting, how we can streamline environmental regulations so that they don't get bogged down in the courts. It was a very different message this year. I think it was a breath of fresh air, finally, that we could address the issues of getting the projects forward as opposed to just fighting the past of legislation and trying to shut the industry down.
Yeah, that is super interesting. In a sense, the previous bottlenecks are not as much of a bottleneck as they used to be. Are there new bottlenecks? Are there new areas that slow things down? Or are things basically moving at a good pace? And I don't expect it to be frictionless, but are there new bottlenecks that are appearing?
I will say, but then I'll change my answer. I'll say there are no bottlenecks. But then I'm going to say right now, what will happen though, a lot of this will end up in the courts. That's where the bottleneck will go. But at least you know what your project is. If you can get your project approved, at that point, you know you have something. Whereas in the past, you never could even get to a project. So the good news is at least you can get to the project, but the bottleneck is going to be, it's going to end up in the courts.
Okay, excellent. So as we start to wrap up, Carolyn, I'm curious just to bring it back to gender. And of course, it was uncommon when you started getting into the mineral and mining industry back, as you said, in the 60s and 70s. I mean, how have you seen things change from your perspective in regard to women in the mining industry from, say, then to now?
It's been a phenomenal change. Like I was president of the California Mining Association. I was elected to 2 terms. I was the only woman ever on the board. And that was, God, for probably 20 years or so. New Mexico Mining Association, the only woman on the board. My era, I was it. There just weren't very many of us. And now I see the 30-year-olds and the 40-year-olds, and they're coming in, but they're coming in different roles. And with technology and with artificial intelligence and the IT side, the industry, the technology is going to change and women are going to fit in very well. And that generation, I think they already see that there's an opportunity for them. And it's such a breath of fresh air because they're going to bring a perspective that maybe that's the message that we'll get, is that when they take over, the messaging will probably be clear at that point.
I mean, are you seeing, like, of course, the numbers on paper, the numbers are increasing of women in the mining industry, but I mean, almost, I'm more curious anecdotally, like, how are you feeling about the numbers that you see? Are you seeing, in a sense, enough numbers? Are you seeing like a significant growth in women around you, say, in the industry, or could it still be a little bit more even, shall we say?
Yeah, that's a good target question because you could say, I see a lot more, but when you're at 0, a few more looks like a lot. So to me, it's a lot more. but it is still dismal in terms of numbers. There is no doubt about that. But like I said, when I'm the only one, just having the Women's Mining Coalition around, that was huge in my era. Now there's all these other Women in Mining UK. I mean, great organization. There's so much more of that, but the numbers are dismal.
What are some of the big challenges, say, that women face in the mining industry today? Like, I imagine they've changed over time. Have some of them held over, so to speak? What are the big challenges that you see that women face in the industry?
I think that the number one challenge is there are no advocates out there for them. We talk about mentoring. Well, your mentor is just going to give you advice, but there are very few women advocates out there, particularly like my age. We're just not around. And until that group increases and brings the women in, the numbers are going to stay low. But the more women you see on boards in terms of hiring, it clearly does make a difference when you have a woman in the interview group. That it's going to take time, but there just aren't enough women advocates out there right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like there's still a lot of work to do, so to speak. And, you know, you telling your story, it doesn't sound like you had necessarily a woman role model, so to speak, that you were following, so to speak, and thought, oh, you know, I'm kind of inspired by that person, and I think I want to do something similar. It sounds like you kind of fell into it a little bit. Like, do you have any sort of women heroes, so to speak, that inspired you to get to where you are, or, you know, or that even if they didn't inspire you, that you are kind of impressed by when you look from a distance?
Sad to say, but no, there weren't any. The only one I would point to is probably my mother. She had a difficult life, being older during World War II, and she worked for the War Manpower Commission, I believe it was called. And I still have her certificate where it's all written as the man and it's marked out. You know, it's like they had to mark out the he and make it she to get her permission to work in the factories. And I guess that gave her probably a different perspective that women can do anything. So I never was held back by her at all. Whatever you want to do. And I know a lot of mothers are concerned about safety and other things. My mom was just like, okay, you love rocks. Okay, that's fine too. Okay, yeah, do whatever you want to do in a positive sense. There was no concern. It was go for it. And if there was concern, she hid it very well. I'm sure she was worried about my safety at times, but she hid it very well.
I feel like we're all thinking of our mom as you describe your mom there. That's beautiful. So as we wrap up here, Carolyn, what kind of advice do you have for, say, you know, women who are coming up, and what are your hopes? What would you like to see happen in the industry in regard to women in the mining industry?
I think the number one example is the Women's Mining Coalition, is having that exposure to that group of other women that are, again, it isn't a CEO organization. It's not a mining association per se of the companies. It's a group of literally haul truck drivers to CEOs. And having that exposure, if they can join that type of a group, they'll learn more and find advocates for the direction that they want to go. And a lot of women ask me for advice. And I always say, you have to assess yourself first. But it's very difficult for them to figure out what they want. And it's like, if you don't know what you want, join the Women's Mining Coalition or one of the other groups, and they can help you focus on the type of company. And there's no problem in changing your direction too. You know, I wanted to be a field geologist. Now I'm doing Indian country and mining leases. So feel free to change. And I hope people will do that they don't get locked into, I want to be a mining engineer, and if I change my mind, I can't do it. If you want to change your mind, I tell them, then change and go do something different.
Carolyn Loder, inductee of the National Mining Hall of Fame and board member of Integra Resources and K2 Gold and board advisor at Kodiak Copper. Thank you for joining us and sharing your very interesting perspective on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
Thank you.
thank you once again to Rua Gold for sponsoring this week's episode of the Northern Miner Podcast. You can find them at ruagold.com. And thank you to Carolyn Loder for appearing on this week's podcast. And thank you, dear listener, for continuing to support this program. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory, share it with your friends, and until next week, take care.